It is a wonderful honor to welcome Dr. James M. Patterson of Ave Maria University to this podcast. He is not to be confused, of course, with the best-selling novelist, James Patterson. Um, and in this hour, we're discussing the late, great Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. James, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. I love talking about Fulton Sheen. Right here, there's normally a giant pile of books. They're over here now. Those are all my Fulton Sheen books.
Wonderful.
I was getting ready. This right here is a second class relic. It's a part of his vestments. So that was given to me by a good friend, one of my very treasured items.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And of course, I should point to your free online course on the wisdom of Fulton J. Sheen is available in Ave Maria's Pursuit of Wisdom program.
That's right.
Okay. First, I'd like to ask, how did you spend your Easter weekend?
I stayed at Ave Maria this time. I stayed in town. We went to the um the 10 o'clock Novus Ordo Mass 30 minutes early, and that was almost too late to find a place to sit.
Mhm.
So yeah, we have a very vibrant Catholic parish here, so we managed to find a place to sit. And then of course I spent most of it pushing around my youngest in a stroller in and around the back of the church. So it was lovely. We did a Easter egg hunt in the front yard. So very Ave Maria, very
Mhm.
bucolic and suburban.
That sounds fun. Okay, so I'd like to begin the discussion on Bishop Sheen by asking whether you paid much attention to the canonization process of his as of late. I know that it is undergoing a few hurdles at this time.
That's right. And it's been widely reported, and I suspect this is the case, is that there was a particular priest who was not living according to the standards of the priesthood at the time that Sheen was Bishop of Rochester, diocesan north uh, part of New York State, and apparently there was some concern about Sheen's handling of it. There's not like a reported problem with what he did. It's just that I think people got nervous because even though they've like vetted the process, they've been through it 100 times. They were afraid that someone somewhere has missed something, and then they would proceed with the beatification, and something comes up, and they all look very foolish. It's a funny problem because Sheen was actually Bishop of Rochester for a very short period of time, not even 3 years. He was an excellent person at theology, philosophy. He was wonderful missionary for the church. He was not a good administrator. He was very high-handed and bossed people around at a time when people were pretty unsettled by some of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And he figured this out about himself pretty quickly and decided just to retire. So he only has this one issue with the priest because he wasn't bishop for very long. But it's a shame because we already have the miracle. The miracle's been verified as such, and we were about to have the beatification in Illinois, and they had to cancel it at the last minute. Now, the background to this is that there was a tussle between the Cardinal of New York, Cardinal Dolan, and no longer bishop, but I believe, but Bishop. I'm not sure if he's still bishop in Peoria, Bishop Jenke. I'm just I have like this thing in my head that he may not be anymore, but that might be something to check. There was a tussle between who would get to have Sheen's body and the relics, and so this is in the background of the pause on the canonization. I'm a little concerned that there may be more to it than just this one particular thing in Rochester. There may still be some unresolved issues there too, but that's purely my speculation. I don't have anything to prove it.
Right. I know that there were some concerns raised about whether um, young children Catholics were abused under the administration of Bishop Sheen. So,
Yeah.
what would you like to? How would you like to address it?
So I don't know. And the thing that I don't fully understand is that you've heard that, I've heard that too, but no one, let's hear it. I don't, so I don't know. I wish I could have a better answer than that, but the thing is that which we've unfortunately learned is that this is actually a relatively common occurrence during this period. That the process of admitting seminarians and a lot of the priests from the old days were not were not great at controlling themselves in this respect. And there's also just less interest in concealing this. So there was kind of like a kind of clericalism for a while in the Catholic press, and now it's the other way, where like they love to hunt this stuff down. Which, if you're going to have one or the other, it's probably better to have the second. Um, but this leads to a kind of defensive posture, so we don't actually get explanations anymore. So maybe you could help me find like what the actual report is, but I haven't been able to find anything. It's been very frustrating.
Yes, the last I've heard of it is that the Attorney General of the state of New York
Yeah,
conducted an investigation, and the conclusion is that Bishop Sheen did not deliberately put children in harm's way. So that was the near exact quote that I can remember. So so far, yeah, he's in the clear, so to speak.
yeah, I'm seeing that here. That was on the 23rd. Sheen is clean at CNA. That I remember reading this. So I was worried that you were mentioning something that had more recently come up and I'd missed.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, like I said, I mean, he was bishop for such a short period of time. There was actually not a lot of opportunities for misbehavior to fall under his direct supervision. Um, so this is almost a year old. Hopefully, things will get moving. But it's the Catholic Church. There's all deliberate speed. Centuries, not minutes, when it comes to the Catholic Church. This canonization already is moving much more quickly than I think people would suspect.
Yes. Well, here's hoping.
That's right.
Okay. So the online course, which I've mentioned, contains three short lectures. The first one concerns hits Bishop Sheen's Catholic education, as well as
Yeah.
um, the um, the hostility against Catholics within America in general, and I suppose New York at that time, and how Bishop Sheen overcame that. The second lecture concerns Sheen's criticism against pre-modern political trends, so to speak,
Yeah.
liberalism, communism, and capitalism. And the third is an articulation of Sheen's synthesis of Catholicism and Americanism.
Right.
Okay, so those would be the three topics of focus I'd like to dive into during our conversation. Um, so let's begin by anti-Catholicism. So
Yeah.
how did the United States come to, I guess, adopt this hostility towards the people of the Pope?
So the United States has, at its early colonial period, primarily two groups of people who are either religious minorities in England, or what we might call adventurers, people who are, seeking their fortune. And the latter category kind of doesn't care about religion, but the former category of these religious minorities actually care deeply about religion. And one of the largest in number were Puritans, and Puritans are were radicals within the Reformation, primarily informed by the theology of what we call Reformed Protestantism. We often call Calvinists. These are not Lutherans. They're like Calvin, Beza, Bullinger, these sorts of Reformed Protestant types, and they hate Catholicism. They see it as the Antichrist. Now, there are lots of Anglican vicars that are part of the established colonies. They're not fond either, but they're nothing compared to the Puritans. And then, curiously enough, there are also what are called recusants, and these are still Catholic Englishmen. And they settle actually in Maryland, which is named after Our Lady. And I have a book over here by my colleague called Our Dear Bought Liberty, Michael Breidenbach here at Ave Maria, writes about the history of that state. But by and large, Catholics outside of Maryland are very few in number and are treated as a curiosity. What really ramps up the anti-Catholicism in the United States is two events that occur almost at the same time. The first is something called the Second Great Awakening, which is this period in which on the frontier and older settlements, there's this enthusiasm for Protestant evangelization, especially among Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists. And so there's this enthusiasm for the Reformation and for Protestant Christianity at exactly the same time. The second event, which is the arrival of the famine Irish, most of whom are Catholic. And there's so these two events kind of create an immediate hostility to the Irish. The Irish are also particularly hated as Catholics because they're seen as traitors to and as like lower forms of humanity, unfortunately, to a lot of people of the English background. So like of all the Catholics to come, the worst, would be the Irish. Whereas the Catholics that had been coming over to the United States in much smaller numbers had been primarily French, escaping the French Revolution, and those were fine, especially because there were fewer of them. They also typically weren't poor. The Irish that were arriving in the United States were desperately poor. And a third thing that I just occurred to me is that on the western frontier of the United States, there was a fear of formerly Spanish and Mexican sort of colonial Catholicism there too. There's Samuel Morse writes Foreign Conspiracy, and Lyman Beecher writes Plea for the West. And after this, it's open season. There's the Bible riots when there's an English language Catholic Bible called the Douay-Rheims published. I think it's how you say that, Douay-Rheims. And there's also a convent burning. And the reason why there's a convent set on fire in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is that for many of these populations, all of these things were completely new. They never knew Catholics. They never had Catholic institutions. They had no idea what a convent did. That's how complete the Protestantism was in the United States, especially in established Eastern Coast parts of the United States. And they honestly believed that the convent was engaging in all kinds of rapacious behavior. And the reason they believed that is one of the most popular writers of the period was under the pseudonym Maria Monk, that spread all of these anti-Catholic stories about priests and nuns doing illicit things in convents. And so popular these books became that it inspired a mob to go burn the convent down. So one exception to this is Louisiana Territory, especially in New Orleans, but they were seen as peculiar. And by the time that, that's in the 1830s to the 1850s, there's another round of anti-Catholicism after the Civil War, with the Blaine Amendments trying to prevent the states from establishing funding opportunities for Catholic churches. This was a terrifying prospect to a lot of Americans that if you started to pay for the Catholic schools that these people wanted to start, it would lead to the treasuries being appropriated by foreign potentates in Rome, the whore of Babylon, and all these other terms that were used. And there's an attempt to hash out a compromise. Archbishop John Ireland's part of that. It falls apart. He gets himself into trouble while he's over in Europe trying to figure it out. So the whole thing's a huge mess. And the final I know this is a long answer, but this is a big question. By the time we get to Sheen, you've had your first Catholic run for president in the United States, a guy named Al Smith. He was governor and a Democrat. He was also very controversially what's called a wet, which means that he opposed prohibition. And this was, not popular among a lot of American Protestants who believed that you could improve the moral fiber of the nation, especially non-Protestants that drank too much. And so this was specifically targeted primarily at Italian, Irish, and other Catholic ethnic minorities. And the election was in 1928, and it was unbelievably anti-Catholic. And the irony is that the person who orchestrated the 28 election against Smith eventually converted to Catholicism, and the person who got him there, his name was Jack Hanna, I think, or John Hanna, was Sheen. So Sheen is the person who is emerging after the Al Smith election with an organization called the National Council of Catholic Men as part of a sort of stable of Catholic speakers on the radio to explain to Americans what the Catholic Church really believes. So it was a form of adopting very early in the history of radio a mass media technique for that purpose, and Sheen was dynamite at it.
Mhm. Yes. Now, what I find quite remarkable is that during this stifling anti-Catholic hostility, and I'm thinking around the 1930s, one of the most famous radio personalities of that time um, was Father Charles Coughlin, who
Yeah.
a Catholic from Canada. I believe that at the height of his popularity, 1 in 3 Americans tune their radios to hear his seething demagogic sermons, as he called
Yeah.
them. So I wonder, to what extent did Bishop Sheen had to overcome this, I guess, dark shadow that that Father Coughlin cast, in that after World War II, if there were another public Catholic, it'll not be someone like Father Coughlin, so to speak.
So the Catholic uh, uh, church in the United States is not quite what people think it is. The bishops retain a lot more control individually than any kind of like papal oversight. And so what Coughlin had wasn't just a very popular radio show, but he had an ally in his bishop whose name was Gallagher, I believe. Coughlin had come in and rolling around. He would have been a Basilian, and he left and started the Shrine of the Little Flower in Detroit. And was part of a kind of Catholic alignment behind FDR. And the reason why people liked Franklin Delano Roosevelt was that he, wanted to recognize unions. He was seen as good for the working man. Of course, privately, he was pretty anti-Catholic, did not like the Irish, but a lot of very famous American Catholics sided with him. Coughlin was one of them. Another one was a guy named John Ryan, who was called jokingly the Right Reverend New Deal, because he was such an enthusiastic supporter. Whereas Ryan actually kind of dies as a young man. It's sad, and he actually was a professor at CUA when Sheen was there as a student. So there was some connection there. But where Coughlin goes off the rails is he sort of becomes part of a kind of populist support for FDR that's very conspiratorial. And so when FDR's New Deal doesn't do or go to the same degree that Coughlin wanted, he starts to look for answers, and the people who are willing to provide him those answers were fascists. And at one point when he had like the Christian Front, he whether he knew it or not, he had to have known. There's no way he didn't. He actually had unregistered foreign agents from the Nazi Party in it, and so he was more popular than Sheen. Sheen was still very popular, and there was a very strong effort to get Coughlin off the air, and eventually it happens after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when he says that the people responsible for the Japanese attack on the Navy was, I don't know how he got to this, was the Jews, which is a pretty spectacular reach. But Sheen, while this was going on, was not saying this. He was saying he was much more opposed to communism early on. He did not like Nazism at all, but he was sort of like uncertain about fascism, because on the one hand Mussolini was good to the church, but he was very bad on a lot of other things. So he sours on Mussolini soon after, though, before anything happens with the American entry into the war. And so he's very much a contrast. And the reason Sheen didn't like these anti-communist but still very authoritarian ideologies is because he saw them usurping the role of the church, and attempting to supplant them with, God dictators, and dissolving the value of the human person. And so he thought of them as lesser forms, or derivative examples of what communists do. And this was much more palatable to people in the Catholic Episcopal hierarchy, as well as people in the United States. But it wasn't perfectly acceptable, because remember, the United States declared as an ally Stalin and the USSR, and Sheen had been railing against Stalin and communism. And so he was very, very unhappy that he had to kind of put that to the stop for a while. And he actually, during one of the broadcasts of Life is Worth Living, is talking about something from the Second World War, and he looks at the camera and says, "I was not allowed to say any of this during the war." And the audience gasps, right? Like, so what's funny is that, I mean, Coughlin's like off the rails terrible, but Sheen was still uh, not perfect for what the FDR administration wanted. And on top of that, the administration didn't like Sheen personally. Like, he was a known figure in New York, and he was known to be a person who was very hard to corral. He did not like to play ball. He was very principled, very prickly about being told what to do. And at one point, someone was hoping they could use Sheen as a way to work their way into a public appointment in an administration. And Sheen's like, you don't want me. I'm not going to be able to be of much help to you. He goes ahead, tries again, and of course, the guy didn't get the job, because getting a letter of recommendation from Sheen was definitely not going to get you a job with FDR. So it's a funny thing where they went with Sheen, but Sheen was inconvenient to them because he actually stood too much on principle.
So, to what extent did Sheen supported the New Deal?
He keeps that conversation at arm's length, but you can tell that he is sympathetic, although not as strenuous as to the position that John Ryan took about the New Deal being necessary. And Sheen believes this because he's not really like a free market capitalist. He's what's called a distributist, which was an economic, not really like school of thought, more of a kind of economic aesthetic that was part of Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. And you see a lot of references to them when Sheen talks about economics. And so he's not a fan of it being part of a government centralized effort, but he does like that the effort is to restore a degree of dignity to work and the ability for persons to work. So he stays at length from endorsing the policy the way that Ryan does. But when you read Sheen, he's very much at peace with it. He's not railing against it as some kind of, usurpation of economic liberty. It's just something he sees as a necessary correction for what he considered to be the excesses of unconstrained capitalism.
Yes. Of course, in his famous show Life is Worth Living, he's very explicit against Soviet communism.
Yes.
But of course, what I find quite surprising is that he doesn't believe that the alternative is laissez-faire capitalism. And I wonder, how would you characterize his opposition to to both of these forces?
So it's a very good question, and the reason is because he has this really great line where he says, what capitalism sells at retail, communism sells at wholesale," and what he means by that is that unconstrained capitalism, and the capitalism I use that adjective intentionally because Sheen is very much of the Leonine social tradition where you have a defense of private property, but the defense of it is based on its moral use for the common good rather than whatever sort of subjective consumer basis that you have in its ownership. And so that version of capitalism where you can use property whatever however you want, he hates. He thinks this is terrible. And the reason why he has this line about retail and wholesale is that what you get in a capitalist system is a treatment of people not as persons with the dignity of God, but rather as different individuals who can be exchanged willy-nilly and are treated primarily as vehicles for efficient production or as consumers to lure in to consume goods that maybe they don't necessarily need. And these are not decent ways of treating persons. And the reason why people get treated this way by capitalists is because the capitalists willingly subject their reason to the passions for money, things like greed. And this dehumanization is therefore not just on the workers, but on the owners. And it leads necessarily to there being more failed capitalists than successful ones. Because if everyone's going to live this way and try to own the largest businesses they can use to exploit workers, only some people are going to get that, and the rest are going to be frustrated with their failure. And so what you get is naturally this vicious condition in which people find themselves is that what they want to do is to seize what others successfully gained for themselves, and that's where the communists come in. The communists are the ones who will come in to the frustrated failed capitalists saying all of you are exploited, and what we need to do is to take the people who are exploiting you and exploit them. And whereas individuals are essentially sort of abstracted and denigrated persons, the communists don't even see distinctions between persons as individuals. They just see what he describes as a mass, lowercase m, as an undifferentiated blob that is designed to do whatever it is the party says. And you don't get to that point unless you have this kind of corrupted version of capitalist exchange. And so neither of these can be allowed. And the version of private property and free exchange that he has in mind is one in which the obligations to the wealthy are sort of built into the structure of businesses. So he has ideas, for example, of there being workers' councils. These are things that are done in Germany even today, where they can hold accountable people within the industry. He's not as fond of unions. He thinks unions are a sort of sign that there's Bolshevism afoot. He would rather this model where instead there's a certain degree of self-governance within employers to hold employers capital responsible for the use of capital. And he also likes, for example, the requirement of people to have not just a lunch hour, but also a period during the day, either probably before, or after, for worship. And he has in mind here, especially because, daily mass being a thing, he has in mind here, especially the Catholic workers. And when you read Sheen on this, he still has a kind of old fashioned idea of what's going to happen at this mass, because he thinks that what's going to happen is that at these religious periods, the managers and the workers will be at the same service or the same mass, and it's probably not going to happen. But he's sort of imagining, in the best case scenario, this might soften some of the divisions that are still part of all of this. So it's very unusual. People, when they hear someone is an anti-communist, they normally expect them to be very pro-capitalist, but Sheen is at best like one cheer for capitalism, and the other two cheers are safe for the church.
Now, on to liberalism. How does Bishop Sheen define his conception of human freedom against liberalism?
So liberalism is a very dicey subject and also a very popular one right now, and for people who talk about Catholic political thought. And Sheen is a very unusual figure in this respect. I wrote something for First Things a couple years ago called "Taking Sheen Seriously," in which I explained that Sheen is an adamant anti-liberal, but also an emphatic Republican with a little R. You're not describing the Republican Party, which he never endorsed any parties like that. He was far too prudent to do something silly like that. So the reason why he's anti-liberal is he sees liberalism, here described as a political philosophy, as as a kind of social and political thought akin to capitalism that will lead to the same problems of eventually a communist theory of politics and society, because liberals can't control the outcomes of the things that they're recommending. And so the real problem with liberalism, as he conceives it, is that liberalism relativizes ends. And since people cannot possibly know what the ultimate end for a human person is, Catholics believe it's participation in the divine, or receiving the grace of God through the sacraments. Because what liberals want to do is essentially back away from any claims like that and say it's really up to the individual. What you end up with is a society that is unmoored from its ends, and therefore whatever means to those ends you have go in all kinds of different directions that are normally very bad. And this is the problem that liberalism has, is that it sort of drifts in the direction of picking the worst possible goods rather than the best. And so he has a real fear that the relativizing of ends eventually leads the worst person who can take advantage of this argument to say, freedom is itself the problem, right? Rather than freely choosing whatever ends you have, what you've really been tricked into believing is that any of you are free in the first place. You're not. What you need instead is to be liberated from the entire struggle to find the good. The real good is in resisting resisting the powers that be. And so there's a kind of nihilism that communism exploits, that's part of the liberal sort of approach. Mm-hmm. So he thinks liberalism is quite bad in this respect. And so you would think then that he would be in favor of like some version of monarchy, because historically in Europe, if you were anti-liberal, you were probably in favor of some version of restoration of a throne and altar regime. But of course, America doesn't have that. He's American, so there's no restoration possible. And what he has instead is a little r republicanism, in which we know what the common good is, religiously speaking, from religious education, that is part of the way of life for each person, or at least it should be. And that religious education informs a citizen not to treat freedom as a condition for selecting whatever relative ends they choose, but rather to reflect on what's possible in a political regime and direct the institutions towards the common goods that are appropriate for secular government, the most obvious of which is peace. Now, you can't use that towards spiritual ends because that's what the church does, but the spiritual ends are directly informed into the citizenry through religious education. And this is how you end up with a kind of confessional state without a confession. This is, why he's not a throne and altar person, but he ultimately believes that the best way to have a confessional state in the United States is for everyone to confess, rather than it being in the Constitution or, part of the seal of the United States, where it appears instead is in the people and in their laws. And you will not get there with liberalism. Instead, where you'll get with liberalism is a kind of what he describes as the flotsam and jetsam of Christianity, sort of leading people holding onto in an ocean of nihilism. until ultimately those things break down and you're just left with the possibility of totalitarianism.
Okay. So I'd like to ask for some follow-up regarding your answer. So
Oh,
how would
sure.
um how would Bishop Sheen tackle the, I guess, what you would call the render unto Caesar problem, or in the American language, it would be the separation of church and state problem.
So Sheen is the way that Sheen understands the separation of church and state is not the way that you normally hear. He thought that generally speaking, a kind of radical secularization was a disaster. It was terrible. And he knew full well that people who argued for that position did so because what they were trying to do was blunt the impact the Catholic Church was having on politics pretty much from the 1830s until the 1970s. There was this real fear of Catholics gaining too much political power. And the people who would argue for the much more radical version of the separation of church and state all came from the same kinds of people. So you had like Senator Blaine from Maine. He was adamant, he was an anti Catholic. You have all of these people suing against the Catholic Church receiving state assistance for their schooling or busing or paying teachers. So all of the examples you get of the separation of church and state and its sort of left liberal variety are clearly motivated by anti-Catholic animus. And so what he did to separate church from state was not to abandon politics. What he did instead was he engaged in the spiritual education of people involved in politics. So he did essentially missionary work to American leaders. And the people that are interested in hearing from him are people like Fiero Guar. I'm sorry. I forgot what's the name of
LaGuardia,
the
right? The mayor of New
LaGuardia.
York.
Thank you. I was trying to remember the airport name, but I kept wanting to say Fiorello Airport. That's not it. But Al Smith himself, the governor of New York, Dwight Eisenhower. There were lots of people who either wanted to look like they were hearing what Sheen had to say or really wanted to hear what Sheen had to say. And then at the state level, Sheen had very close friendships with people and directly ministered to people. But probably the most interesting figure he had an influence on was Clare Boothe Luce, who was a Catholic convert. And she was actually a member of Congress from Connecticut and a Republican. And when she converted, she actually decided not to run again because she was so concerned about anti-Catholicism becoming a part of her reelection campaign. But he by no means thought it was untoward for clergy to participate directly in the spiritual advising to help shape the conscience of lawmakers. But he didn't want the state to fund, not fund. He didn't want the state to essentially confess a particular religious belief that would then push out all other believers. And he thought this was a violation of the rights of conscience and attempted far too much tyranny by states engaging in the regulation of those sorts of things. And whereas a lot of American Catholics today think that might be a quote liberal approach, for Sheen it was very practical. He has to remember very clearly much of his life all of the problems of anti-Catholicism, the first of which he experienced in his own home. He had a half sister that was removed from the home because the mother who had died was Protestant, and her Protestant family wanted the child, his half sister, to be raised Protestant. And so she was removed from the Sheen home and given over to the grandparents. So when Sheen hears about the idea of there being a direct intervention of the state on religious issues, what he hears is Catholics getting really beat down, worse than they're already getting beat down by so-called separation of church and state issues. So it's an interesting thing. And he was always very careful not to pick one side or the other in the political parties. He would essentially take all comers because everyone was an opportunity to hear the gospel. And so that's generally how that played out.
Okay. Um, so with all the background of hostility and animus against Catholics during Sheen's time, um, how does he reconcile American republicanism with his own Catholic faith?
So yeah, you would think, after getting kicked in the teeth so much, he would probably not like the country. But patriotism is a virtue under pietas. It's so you have to find what is recoverable in the regime that's celebrated as virtue, and extol people to celebrate those things as well as know what is wrong and not to do those things anymore. So Sheen is part of what I call the Catholic American tradition, Republican tradition. I wrote an article about it a couple years ago for an academic journal, and there are a few popular articles I wrote that are sort of based off that research. One of them is called like two Catholic nationalisms for law and liberty, and the idea that he has here is a principle called Americanism, and I always thought this was very strange because Americanism is a condemned heresy. So people freak out sometimes when I tell people that Sheen was an Americanist. I do that on purpose. So Americanism as a heresy refers to the idea of practical or active virtues being better than passive or contemplative ones. This heresy has a lot to do on background with divisions within the American hierarchy, and a guy I mentioned earlier, Archbishop John Ireland, making a lot of people mad in France. So Sheen is not talking about that kind of Americanism. And the other meaning of Americanism that is fraught is that Americanism was actually the term that American Protestants used to contrast with Catholicism. So one way they would stress the alien nature of Catholic life was by saying that America is Protestant and therefore Americanism is opposed to Catholicism. And so when Sheen uses this term, and he uses it a lot, especially earlier in his life, when he's doing radio stuff, so pretty much 1930 to 1955, he's using this term a great deal. So 25 years. He By this he means the Declaration of Independence is a respecter of persons. And so when you see a Declaration of Independence, it only makes sense as what he calls a Declaration of Dependence. And that Declaration of Dependence is a dependence on God. So the invocations of what is called natural theology, that is, that there's not a sectarian interpretation of God in the Declaration, but there's one that you can know maybe by reason. He's fine with this, and he says that the Declaration is, in principle for the state, what the gospel is for the soul. And he comes to this conclusion on the basis of these same Republican commitments that he takes so seriously in I mentioned already. But the way Americanism works is that it doesn't start with Sheen. Sheen is actually inheriting this way of thinking about America as a Catholic from people as far back as some of the only Catholic signer of the Declaration, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and his brother John Carroll, who was a bishop, first Catholic bishop of the United States. And there's this kind of like a way that Catholics try to treat America as something that Catholics can endorse. And there's and the two Catholic nationalisms essay, I write how there's actually like a minor thread, especially among German Catholics, to treat America as basically hostile territory. And the reason why the Germans feel this way is that the Irish predominate the hierarchy, and they actually are just as bad as the American Protestants as far as they're concerned, because the Germans want things to be done the German Catholic way. So there's a lot of ethnic tensions in the 19th century that lead to this. And Sheen doesn't pay any attention to this. By the time he's writing, a lot of that stuff's water under the bridge. But this tradition of treating the United States as something very Catholic is to find the things that are best about the American experiment, show how they have grounding either by origin or reconciliation to existing Catholic social teaching. And where it doesn't, steer it in the right direction. So things like the separation of church and state, meaning enforced secularization, that's not to be tolerated. So there's a lot of discussion from Sheen about how democracy can't be the thing that we all celebrate, because democracy ultimately rests the rights of human beings on the majority, and the majority therefore can rule against the rights of minority and subject them to a kind of tyranny. And this, of course, to Sheen makes a lot of sense to talk about, because Catholics are, despite being a very large denomination, are in many places in the United States a very small minority. And he doesn't like the idea of the divine rights of kings, because that is, to his mind, is a presaging of totalitarian dictatorships. And so that's the idea of the nation being something that's a plaything of an ideological party. And he says instead, the reason that we celebrate the Declaration and we celebrate as a result America is because our rights come from God. And if our rights come from God, then no one can take them away. And if they attempt to, we can fight back.
Okay. So you've said in one of your lectures that uh, Bishop Sheen is a Thomist.
Yes.
So without diving too much into the vast philosophy of Saint Thomas Aquinas, give us an overview of how the Italian friar influenced Bishop Sheen's thinking.
So this is a great question, and it's part of the reason why it's a great question is that normally when people think of Neo-Thomism, they think of from the period that Sheen comes out, they think of a guy named Garrigou Lagrange, Reginald Garrigou Lagrange, who was a Dominican friar. Sheen knew him and cited him in his academic work. But there's like this huge flowering. So Garrigou Lagrange is one example. Sheen's another of Thomism as a rejuvenated school of thought. In the late 19th and early 20th century, this is partly a response from especially Leo the 13th, Pope Leo the 13th's call for the rehabilitating Thomas as a source for spiritual and philosophical insight into the new problems of the modern world. So things like industrial capitalism, labor problems, workers' rights versus the rights of private property owners, in addition to all of the issues of modernism and other sort of heresies of the period, indifferentism and things like that. And so the universities that are Catholic adopt this command very earnestly, and the one that becomes the kind of capital for all of this is University of Louvain in Belgium, and it under the influence of a guy named Cardinal Mercier. I believe I'm getting this right. I'm a political scientist, right? I don't do a lot of church history unless I need to. But in this case, I did need to. But I'm wondering if I should have maybe reviewed this part a little better. There was a Cardinal Mercier Prize, and Sheen won it. And so what Sheen was learning at Louvain, after having already gone to the Catholic University of America, and before that St. Viator College, was nothing but Thomism. And the reason he needed to learn it there was that these were where the best Thomists were. And the way that Aquinas was taught there was in the original Thomism. So what happens to Aquinas is treated just like any other sort of great theologian. Immediately after his death, he's sort of applied and taken, and their efforts to kind of solve problems in his work or build off of a foundation of his work. And this goes all the way through, even like during the Counter Reformation with figures like Suarez and Bellarmine. But after them, there's a kind of decline in Thomistic thought, in which the way Thomism is primarily taught is through these like secondary and tertiary thinkers. And there's not a lot of reading of the original texts. And the reason for this is that it's actually very hard to get these original texts. Some of them are very difficult to read. And of course, Aquinas, despite being a systematic thinker, is also a very challenging author. And so what this eventually means to Sheen is that he has to go there and he has to read the original texts. And only then does he like begin to see how they're part of a broader way of thinking. And you can actually see the technique of Aquinas in the way Sheen answers questions in public, right? So in all the episodes of Life is Worth Living, there is a Thomistic structure to the presentation. He does one thing that he adds, and Aquinas definitely doesn't, but he maybe should have, is he adds a joke at the beginning. Sometimes when you read Aquinas, you could use a break. And Aquinas is no, okay, no, it's just gonna be question after question. If you don't like it, step off the bus. So Sheen adds a joke, and then he raises a question, and then he gives you a few possible answers, and then he gives you what he thinks is the right answer, and then he goes back and answers all the other questions. So in Sheen, you get the practical application of the, question one, question two, sed contra, and then respondeo, right? It's all of these different features. So the Thomistic way of thinking is in the spiritual advising and in the philosophical and political advising that he does to the people, but it's done in a way that's meant to provide virtue to Republican citizenry. And the reason that's so important is that in a republic, the citizenry needs to be virtuous to remain a republic for much longer. And of course, this is something Aquinas also knew and taught in his own work. So it's very interesting. It's not just that his argumentation, his learning, and his also the issues that he confronts are all very Thomist ones. He does a lot of philosophy of science in the beginning of his academic career, stuff that doesn't get as much attention as the TV show does. But it's also like all the way down to the way that he approaches his audiences. They didn't know it, but they were hearing like a slightly simplified version of a Thomistic answer to a question.
So here's what I'd like to end on.
Oh,
The
okay.
phrase Judeo-Christian ethic. I know
Yeah.
that you've invoked that phrase in one of your lectures. I'm not sure to what extent Bishop Sheen uses it frequently, but I know that when we today hear it, we think of it as a quaint phrase that I guess conservatives and right-wingers use. But in the 20 or so centuries before this one, it would be unthinkable that Judaism and Catholicism and Protestantism share a common moral and ethical code. So in many ways, the phrase Judeo-Christian ethic or values should not be a quaint phrase because it represents this unification of these three separate faiths that if you turn over any rock of history that involves either two or all three of them, you would find a very fraught and bloody history of conflict between them. So,
Which of course, oh, sorry.
yes. So my question to you is, how does Bishop Sheen reconcile these three faiths under this umbrella of Judeo-Christianity?
So you're right to say he doesn't use the term. And when I use this term, it's more that this was a term in use when he was doing his work. Sheen's very careful not to use it. And I think the reason for this, and I actually haven't written about this, and the reason is this is still just something I'm surmising from reading him. It's not something I've really done a lot of deep diving on. It's that he wants to preserve the distinctions because they're meaningful and precisely the way that you just described. So meaningful had they been in the past that they had led to a lot of animus among the three groups. So the way that he puts it, and this is from Communism and the Conscience of the West, page 46 of the original volume. I have there's some really dynamite or reprint. Sorry, I got away from the microphone there by Clooney. This is Communism and the Conscience of the West that Clooney did. I owe them a review. This is the original version of the book. And it says like this: Jews, Protestants, and Catholics alike, and all men of goodwill are realizing that the world is serving their souls with an awful summons, the summons to heroic efforts at spiritualization. An alliance among Jews, Protestants, and Catholics is not necessary to fight against an external enemy, for our wrestling is not against the flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of this darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in high places. It's Ephesians 6:12. Neither is a unity of religion we plead for that is impossible, when purchased at the cost of the unity of the truth. So you'll hear note that implicitly the Catholic Church is the true faith. But we plead instead for unity of religious peoples, wherein each marches separately according to the light of his conscience, but strikes together for the moral betterment of the world. A unity through prayer, not hate. So he's very insistent on this alliance, but you'll note that the reason he keeps them separate is because ultimately he's Catholic. He believes the Catholic Church has all of the truth of the Revelation, and through it you will receive salvation nowhere else. And that's very fitting of a Catholic priest and bishop, eventually bishop. But when we're talking about this unity of religious persons, what he sees them doing is akin to what other people mean by the Judeo-Christian ethic, namely to find a source of common agreement on for the purposes of advancing the common good of peace in temporal affairs. So we're not going to find peace in spiritual affairs. That's not purchasable because it's ultimately sacrifice of truth. But in temporal affairs, this means that Jews, Protestants, and Catholics need to resist, in this case, communism as a source for dehumanization, seizure of the property people need in order to live, the mass murder, imprisonment, and other forms of defacing the human, the image of God in each human person in occupied communist countries. So the term is something that sort of builds up around Sheen as he's doing his work. And one day I'll make the master document of all of Sheen's published writings that we can recover to find and do a massive search on a big computer to make this happen. But what I suspect I'll find is that if he uses the term, it might almost be sort of like quoting someone else or incidental, or maybe even like a slip in judgment. But the term is very important because what Sheen is trying to get is he's trying to get Catholics as part of the conversation in the United States. And the reason why he wants to do this is that the United States had been presumptively Protestant for so long that it never even bothered to learn what the Catholic Church might have to offer. And moreover, given what had happened in Germany during the Second World War to Jews, there needed to be an accounting for their presence in the United States, even though they're not very large in number. They seem to be a group of people who we need to hear from as well. Now, Sheen is actually before the Second World War talking about the Jews as the elder brothers in our faith, and this makes him very different from Coughlin, as we were talking about before. And the reason he was doing this was out of real concern for anti-Semitism. And that concern about anti-Semitism is, on the one hand, very much part of his spiritual mission, and he very much believed that Jews are our elder brothers in the faith. But he also saw that what happens to them is what's going to happen to Catholics, and happens to Catholics too. It may be more often than even happens to the Jews, because there's just more Catholics in the United States. And so the hope is that Jews and Catholics can sort of demand a seat at the table at a time when Americans really understood themselves, in part, their relationship to religious life. And this happens. What happens is actually funny, is that the reason they get a seat at the table is that Protestants have this huge crisis in the United States over something called the fundamentalist debate. And all the ones who didn't want Catholics and Jews at the table picked up their toys and went home. Right? They decided they weren't going to contest the issue anymore. They would found their own institutions, and the more liberal Protestants were more than happy to have Protestant Jews at the table, only to find out that one of the first people who's going to kind of lead this tri-faith America, as one scholar puts it, ended up first being a Catholic. Which is definitely not what they had in mind. The divines at Princeton Theological Seminary were probably not thinking some son of an Irish Catholic farmer out in the middle of nowhere in Illinois who's going to come rocketing onto the scene and become the conscience of a nation during and after the Second World War, and then win an Emmy in 1952. By the time Sheen's leaving the airwaves, a lot of these liberal Protestant denominations are beginning to decline in numbers at exactly the moment when the Catholic Church feels unbeatable. But of course, we opened up talking about his canonization, and we know that the Catholic Church in the United States was not unbeatable if it beats itself, right? If it engages in these kinds of forms of self-sabotage. So getting back to the kind of spiritual strength we have in this country really means learning from what Sheen said and forming ourselves according to a lot of his very prudent lessons for Americans.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Dr. James Patterson of Ave Maria University, for joining this show.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, Mr. Wynn.